Here we go. So this week we are going to discuss how much did Moshe know. So we're not going to focus on the most popular part of this week's parsha, namely the sin of the golden calf, but we're going to focus on what happened in the aftermath afterwards, because it'll also hopefully shed a little bit of light on what happened prior as well, for how on earth could the Jews have sinned. So this will hopefully enlighten that as well. It's adding a little bit of complexity to the story. So we're starting from the verse at the end of the parsha, where afterwards, after Moshe had destroyed the Luchot, God tells Moshe to Tov Luchat Devarim Ha'ela, right, to write all of these commandments. So the question is, when he's told to write these things down, the question is, what exactly is included in what is being written down? So one simple answer could be, what is being written down here? So, well, let's say the previous parsha. But so that would be the simple understanding, but that's not what the Midrash is going to go with. As we're going to see in just a second, we will pick apart the Midrash, and I'll be calling on people to read if they're up for it. If not, I will be reading. I'll be reading myself. So not to worry. So here we go. So write for yourself these words. So describe yourself these words, and then so again, the English here is taken from Sefaria. If anything's unclear in the English here, just let me know. So what are the things that we read that are written here? So we quote a pasuk from Moshe saying, "Echtov lo ruvei torati kamo zar nechshavu." I write for them the great things of my law, of the Torah, and like strange things they are considered. So the question is, why on earth would you choose this verse particularly to parallel Moshe finally writing down of the Torah? But until now, Bnei Israel had been, given some law, according to Midrash at least, and the Gemara had been given some laws at Marah. They had they knew about Man, they knew about Shabbos, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And they heard the start of Deborah, but they haven't heard everything yet. So we're trying to say that Moshe's first writing things down. So why are we quoting a pasuk from Moshe, which is not a very positive pasuk? In case you're wondering if it doesn't look so positive from the statement of the law is considered to be a zar, like strange things, like a foreigner. So we can look at the actual psukim from Hosea themselves and see just how terrible that context of that verse is. So here we have the psukim from Hosea. The context, which we'll see, will actually parallels quite well with what was going on by Chet Egel. So Hosea was one of the prophets for the northern kingdom of Israel, which was also known as the more wicked kingdom. The most prominent. So the prophets you may have heard of for the northern kingdom are Hosea, Amos, and Eliyahu Hanavi. Those are the three most prominent ones that prophesied in the north, and they didn't really have such a warm acceptance by the north, and they were pretty harsh in their critiques of that. And as we know by the fact that the northern tribes got exiled first, they didn't really listen very well either. So he's talking about, again, this is a couple of centuries before the exile. So here's what again, there's a longer list, but here's some of what like the whole parak has a list of what the tribe of Ephraim, meaning the northern kingdom, is doing wrong. So now we're discussing some of the things that they did wrong. So for Ephraim has multiplied altars for guilt, meaning he's guilty for his doing so. His altars have redounded to his guilt. Okay, notice the doubling of sin here with the construction of altars. And remember the altar that had just been constructed and then destroyed had been constructed by Bnei Israel and then destroyed by Moshe after he returns down from Har Sinai. And then Hosea continues. Echtov lo ruvei torati kamo zar nechshavu. The main teachings that meaning that God had written, had been treated as something alien, meaning the Jews disregarded the Torah. And then it continues. When they present these sacrifices to me, it is but flesh for them to eat. The Lord has not accepted them. Behold, he remembers their iniquity. He will punish their sins back to Egypt with them. So if you had heard these words immediately following Chet Egel, you'd have said, this fits perfectly. They made altars when they should have been making altars. They are offering sacrifices that are not actually sacrifices, but are just actually excuses to eat. And potentially they will be punished returning to Egypt. So this seems quite harsh. And it just seems strange that why would you want to connect Moshe is receiving the Torah after Har Sinai, after the Chet Egel, and when he's finally gotten back. Well, why are we now tying back into the sin before? Didn't the Bnei Israel do tshuva? Didn't Moshe already beg for their forgiveness? Like what happened here? So to that, let's see what the rest of the Midrash says, and maybe it'll hopefully clue us in a little bit as to why this very negative verse was chosen, beyond just the parallels that we've seen. So the Midrash continues. So as opposed to what you would have normally expected the Midrash to continue with, instead continuing on with the potentially what the Jews did wrong, instead it focuses on what is given to Moshe. So what is given to Moshe? Continue in the Midrash. So when God revealed himself at Har Sinai to give the Torah to Israel, he said to Moshe the following. He said to him the entirety of the Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, and all of the Agadah, all of these stories surrounding it as well. As it says, God spoke all of these words, saying, even what a student will ask. So this implies that all the Torah is being given now. So that sounds great. So the next thing God then says to Moshe, after Moshe has learned all the Torah, is teach it to Israel. So the question would be, why is this relevant now after what had just occurred? Any ideas? Why would we now want to be talking about, all the Torah being able to be taught to all of the Jews after they have done this terrible mistake of Chet Egel? Why now? And why mention that it's everything, even all the future questions?
Well, learn to do the right thing maybe they don't know how to do the right thing.
Right? Maybe they don't know how to do the right thing, and once they learn, that'll be okay. Right? Once you teach them everything, that'll be sufficient. But there's another option, a little darker option, that even if you teach them everything, that is still no guarantee of their necessarily following everything. So now we're going to keep going on in the Midrash and see how the rest of the story unfolds. So then Moshe said to God, Hashem, should I write it down? And God said, I am not asking you to give it to them in writing, because it is known to me that in the future, the nations will rule over them and take the Torah away from them, and it will be degraded by the nations. So the scriptures I will give them in writing, but the Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadah I will give orally. Because the nations will enslave them, the Jews will be different and unique from the nations. So what is the answer for why we are given some written Torah and oral Torah? What is the answer here? What is the purpose? Not so that they'll know, but something else. What is that something else that God's trying to impart by giving us not just a book of rules?
So we'll be unique.
Right? It's supposed to be transformational and change the very nature of the Jews. To change something that they can't have taken away from them. So
sorry, could it be that you don't want the nations to misinterpret it?
Right, that's definitely one option. We don't want, if it's in writing, the non-Jews will start reading it and they'll start doing weird things with it. For more on that, you can look at the interesting history of Christian Kabbalah, if you'd like, or Christianity in general, which is them stealing our stuff and deciding it's theirs. right? So then definitely the non-Jews take our stuff and they start changing it. So, but on the other hand, but how do we ensure that they can't simply take it? We ensure they can't take it by internalizing it and making it part of us. That's how they can't take it from us. Making sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. Right? So once we internalize the Torah, it's not simply a set of rules and scriptures that can be simply thrown away. It becomes part and parcel of who we are. Then it's impossible for it to be taken away, and it also means it's impossible for us to forget it. Which would also serve to help solve the question I asked earlier about why would we quote the book from Moshe? Because in Moshe we see that the people had failed to internalize what the Torah was all about. They simply viewed it as a book and they put it on the shelf. They abandoned it. But if Torah actually is part and parcel of who the nation of the Jewish people is, then that's not an option, because you will always be affected by the Torah and you can't simply leave it on the shelf. So now the Midrash continues. So here's the continuation. This is now we're getting back to our original quotation from Hosea. So what did God tell Hosea? If I write for them the great things of my law, they will be considered like strangers. That means if everything is written down, it'll lead to a problem. So what instead is God going to do? God says that he will give them the written Torah, but the Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadah should remain oral. And when we say to inscribe these words for yourself, to write them down, this is referring only to the Torah Shabbat. According to these words, when we say al piadrim ha'eleh, this is referring to the Mishnah and the Talmud, because this is what's going to separate the Jews from the nations. So it appears that if we were to simply write down all of the Torah as well as the Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral law, if it's all written down, it will lead to the Jews becoming estranged from it. So rather, it's given to them orally such that they will be able to internalize it properly and be able to be separate from the nation in a proper fashion. So as far as overall the message of this Midrash, before we get to the part where I throw a monkey wrench into things, so from what we see now is the Torah Shabbat Peh is given as a way of something to be internalized by the Jewish people to make them unique. And it's not simply written down, because even if everything was written down, that would not be enough. And the Jews would not be able to remain a distinct people. They could at any moment abandon it. And seemingly that's what they had done in the past. And so it's important that it's given that they make sure to transmit the Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral Torah, orally, because it will also help improve them as well and keep them distinct from the nations as well, and help them remain as being proper Jews. Okay. All right. So the next question we have is that to focus back. Notice in the beginning that we mentioned that to what extent was everything taught to Moshe Rabbeinu? We said that what was he taught? Not only did he get the Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadah, but even what a student will ask his teacher. So that seems to be very all-encompassing. The Torah Shabbat Peh that Moshe received had literally everything included. The only problem with this is a Gemara in Menachot, which discusses when Moshe Rabbeinu ends up coming down and sitting in Rabbi Akiva's classroom. So would somebody like to read the translation of the Gemara Menachot?
Okay, I'll read it. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God said to him, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounds upon mounds of halachot. It is for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah.
Okay, now Moshe responds back. Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, return behind you, meaning look backwards and you'll see it. So Moshe went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. Moshe's strength waned, and as he thought, his Torah knowledge was deficient. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, my teacher, from where do you derive this? Rabbi Akiva said to them, it is a halakha transmitted to Moshe from Sinai. When Moshe heard this, his mind was at ease, as this too was part of the Torah he was to receive. So the question is, so how did Moshe not understand what was going on? So I'm going to skip this next part of the Gemara, and we will go straight to the question for how could he not follow? Right. So how could Moshe received all the Torah, every single element. So how is it possible that Moshe didn't follow? Right? There was nobody as great as Moshe. How could he not follow in Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash when the rest of the students seemingly could? So this we have the Rashi Menachot. That explains why. That is explaining why Moshe felt better when he heard that they said that Rabbi Akiva said it was a halacha Moshe Sinai. What is his answer? Moshe felt better since Rabbi Akiva said it is his name, that even though Moshe hadn't received it yet. So what does it imply? That why does Moshe not understand? He doesn't understand because he didn't learn it yet. Moshe will eventually be able to understand Rabbi Akiva's teaching, but right now he doesn't know. Because right now Moshe is in the beginning of writing down the Torah. He hasn't gone through the whole thing yet. He's just starting out. It's unreasonable for somebody who's starting out from the very base, from the first starting to learn Torah, to be able to understand in advanced class. There's no way. So Moshe is reassured knowing that he will eventually have the knowledge to be able to follow. Just right now he doesn't. So that's Rashi's answer. So there's several other answers to this question. So one answer we find in another Midrash. I believe this is in the next week's parsha, I believe. So the question is, how much Torah did Moshe learn when he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights? So who'd like to read this one?
Okay, let me read again.
Thank you, Lee.
There's no other volunteers. Did Moshe learn the whole Torah? It is written, it is longer than the land and wider than the sea from Eov. And Moshe learned it in 40 days. Rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu taught Moshe the general principles.
Okay, so why didn't Moshe know what was taught in Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash? Because he never learned it. He had never heard of it, and therefore whatever it was Rabbi Akiva was teaching, he never heard of it and never will. And that's why he's confused. Because he was taught general principles. He wasn't taught the specifics of what to do with the crowns. So simply, this was an element that he may have had the general rules, but if you give somebody, a rule book, they're not going to be let's say you give somebody a rule book for chess, they will not at the end of the day be able to be an expert, a grandmaster, and that's fine. It's just that's the stage at which Moshe was given. He wasn't given it with all the trappings. So of course, this answer might be a lot less satisfactory than the previous one because it implies a lack of ability, or at least in Torah learning on Moshe's part, which is completely fair. So there's another answer that's in a similar vein that we see in the Sefer Halkarrim. So this was written by Joseph Albo in Castile in the 15th century. It was a response to the to some of the many popular 13 principles, the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam and other. So he basically didn't like it because he felt it was very constraining, and it may or may not lead to a lot of people who actually being excluded from the faith by people, I mean Rishonim, as well as figures in the Talmud and Mishnah. So he didn't like the way that Rambam broke it down, and he gave different examples. So, for instance, this is commenting on the principle of the divine origin of the Torah and to what extent is things part of the Torah. And he's mentioning about to what extent and what exactly did Moshe receive at Har Sinai, and to what extent we are bound by all of it. So in this context, he mentions that the laws of things that are acted upon it are many more than can be told. Therefore, Moshe was given at Sinai the ways and rules that hinted at the Torah in short, so that on them the rabbis learned out in every generation the new explanations. So yes, Moshe received the Torah Shebachtav, and yes, he received the Torah Sheba'al Peh, but he did not receive absolutely everything. In addition to what he received, there also were tools that he was given and rules that could later be used by others. So therefore, each of the rabbis, every generation, will be able to be mitchadesh, to give new explanations, to give chidushim. Again, not that there's anything wrong with what Moshe had been taught or given, not that there's anything short of it. Rather, it's just that, I mean, it does say it short, but is that Moshe wasn't given every single detail. Some of the details can be worked out, assuming that you know the general rules. And so the fact that Moshe hadn't gone through every single possible nafkamina, every single possible differentiable case that has a difference, doesn't mean that he wouldn't be able to. Just that just because you've learned arithmetic doesn't mean that you know every single possible equation off the top of your head. It means that you learned it. And yes, given enough time and effort, you could learn it. But just right now, you haven't gone through it all. So that's why Moshe Rabbeinu was unable to follow, because that particular point that Rabbi Akiva learned out using the rules that he had received from Moshe Rabbeinu, from the various chains of the various generations. So Moshe simply wasn't familiar with all the chains in between, which made it hard for him to follow. But not that there's anything wrong with Moshe's Torah that he received or his ability to follow. Just he missed out on several centuries in the middle, which made it a little bit harder. So there's a third answer, which is given by the Maharal Prague of Golem fame. So let's the full version is on the right in Hebrew. This is I give a brief summary in English. It's actually 3 more pages. I just for the sake of brevity, I cut it down and summarized it. So also because a lot of the terms uses don't translate well from Hebrew to English. So here we go. So we'll look at the English. If you like the Hebrew is there for you. And hopefully we'll be able to, again, if you want to look at the full treatment of the story, this is from Maharal's Chidushei Agadot on the Gemara Menachot, where he goes through the whole story and all the elements of the story and what he thinks each is referring to. It's excellent if you have the time. So, but here's the point that's relevant to what we're asking. The question of how is it possible for Moshe not being able to follow when he is in the class of Rabbi Akiva? So here we go. You should not be surprised that Moshe did not understand, but don't say that Rabbi Akiva is on a higher level. But everything was said about this matter, which Moshe Rabbeinu did not have a connection to the crowds. So what is the issue? The issue is that Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't as connected to the Tagin as Rabbi Akiva was. Rabbi Akiva, for whatever the reason, had a deep connection to the crowns on the letters. So what Moshe received was through prophecy, and not through his own efforts at trying to understand the Torah. Moshe didn't fail to understand what they were saying. Rather, he couldn't understand how Rabbi Akiva achieved it without prophecy. So what is the Maharal's answer? that Moshe very much would have had the ability to understand it. But in order for Moshe to have achieved that end, he would have had to rely on his superpower, so to speak, his connection to God, his ability of nevuah, in order to reach the depths of the secrets of the Torah and what each of the various crowns mean. So what Moshe couldn't understand is how are all these people getting to that point without the assistance of prophecy, the ability to turn to God, who is the greatest teacher, and say, God, I don't understand, and then can be helped with a prophecy. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, does this whole thing, is able to grasp it all on his own, without prophecy. And that is why Moshe is so impressed, as well as why he's so confused, because he simply can't. But it also explains why Moshe is so reassured when he hears that, what Rabbi Akiva's response of, I heard it from Moshe Rabbeinu, that is a lot, that he hears this a lot from Moshe Sinai. Because when he hears that, he's reassured that, true, well, he might not currently be able to understand because he has not looked into it with his prophetic lens. But he knows that all that is being taught here isn't simply some conjecture they made up, but rather it is all connected to the chain of Torah that he starts when he brings down from Har Sinai. So while yes, the chain is complicated and is long and it may be difficult to learn, but at the end of the day, it is truly worth it, and it connects back to the original prophecy as well. So there is one other potential explanation, which is possibly the worst answer. But we're going to have to give the last explanation for how Moshe Rabbeinu didn't understand. We have to look at the real point where Moshe said he didn't understand. So this is the end of the Gemara Menachot that I left for last. So Moshe returned and came before God and said to him, God, you have a man as great as this, yet you still chose to give it the Torah through me. Why? Hashem said to Moshe, be silent. This intention arose before me. Moshe said to God, Master of the universe, you've shown me Rabbi Akiva's Torah. Now show me his reward. God said to him, return to where you were. Moshe went back and saw that they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher shop, as Rabbi Akiva was tortured to death by the Romans. Moshe said before God, Master of the universe, this is Torah and this is its reward? God said to him, be silent. This intention arose before me. So what does this story tell us, as opposed to what we've seen before? What is different about this? Is that we see Moshe asking a question to God, and his response is, you couldn't possibly understand. Twice this is his question, right? Moshe asks a question and God says, you cannot fathom what it is. So how would this help us understand why Moshe didn't understand what happened before?
Sorry, I'm confused.
The question is,
a lot of ifs and this and
what connection is there between Moshe asking questions that have no answers to we had before where Moshe said he couldn't follow? Right? Why do we need to hear about Rabbi Akiva's end? The story could have been, like, this part of the story is unnecessary, right? We explained it very well. We ignored this part. Yes.
Well, maybe it's showing that even Moshe is a person.
Right. Even Moshe is a person. So there are limitations.
What was that?
Right. Moshe is a person who has limitations.
Right. So he's not a deity. He is a person. He does not understand. He does not know. He couldn't possibly understand. Even he's the greatest person. He doesn't necessarily understand everything that, one second, that God has plans. And I don't know. Moshe's a person with limitations. Yeah.
Correct. right? Moshe has limitations. We shouldn't mistakenly think that Moshe is God. Right? What is one of the slight issues that sometimes comes up when you say Moshe knew everything that was going to be taught in the future? Is that sounds an awful lot like Moshe is divine, meaning that Moshe in and of himself is somehow godlike. But the point being is that Moshe is not divine. Moshe is the greatest prophet we ever had and ever will have, which is true. But Moshe is still a man, a great man, but a man nonetheless. So there are limits to what Moshe is able to comprehend. And sometimes things that God does, we simply can't truly comprehend. So to go back to our original question of how does this relate to the Techeta Egel and why this is being mentioned now, why we quoted such a negative verse that seems to parallel Techeta Egel so well, is that sometimes when people are trying to replace somebody who they place on such a high pedestal that they are almost divine, they can't properly understand what they are doing and what they're trying to fix. They try to replace Moshe, but but Bnei Israel had viewed Moshe perhaps even as a deity. And this is showing that Moshe most certainly is not one. It is showing the frailty of human life as well as the limits of human capabilities, while unfortunately showing the end of one of our great sages.
So,
yes.
Okay, but the Torah, I can't say that the Torah goes to great lengths, but the Torah does not hide that the people in the stories and the people in the Torah are people. They don't hide it at all. They're presented with all their boo-boos. You have Abraham and lying to Avimelech, and Yitzchak lies to Avimelech, and Yaakov with the whole, I don't know if this goes in the same category, but with the whole, Yaakov with Rivka and the whole like switcheroo, Yehuda, like every human like crack is shown.
Correct. But there also is at certain times an element of reverence too. So the point being is that it's showing a clear distinction between human capabilities and divine. So we don't make the mistake of, which happens in other religions, such as we mentioned Christianity, so may as well growl on some more, right? Christianity, which when they raise people to being saints, so many of over the millennia have considered Christianity to be outright avodah zarah because of the way they revered the saints, because they give them a semi-divine level and they have their own powers that surpass nature. So, and people worship them and pray to them directly. So perhaps that might also be part of it. So to humanize the people, to humanize them as well.
Okay.
So now let's summarize what we've covered so far.
Can I talk
so again, we have discussed what exactly Moshe received at Har Sinai, how he may have received to what extent. Here, let's just go here. I have a little summary right here. So again, let's start with we had two midrashim. One of Moshe receiving absolutely everything, and one of Moshe being lost in the classroom of Rabbi Akiva. Right. So how is that? And yet he's consoled at the end. He's consoled in the fact that what Rabbi Akiva learned is from Har Sinai, but he's not consoled about. But he never gets an answer to why did Rabbi Akiva meet such an ignoble end? Why is it a tragic ending? And why Rabbi Akiva is not fit to replace Moshe if Rabbi Akiva was so great and so knowledgeable? The answer to both those questions is God does it. Is that's for God to know and for us to have to accept. But within the question of how could Moshe not have known everything? So we looked at three approaches. So we saw Rashi's approach, which is that Moshe eventually will know everything in the Torah. Rather, at the time he did not, and that's why he was confused. We saw the Shemot Rabbah and the Sefer Halkarrim, which said that Moshe wasn't given absolutely everything. He was given, general rules, not all the fully worked out details. And it was up to Moshe and everybody else to eventually fill it in. And that's why each generation has their own new comments, because they're building on the existing framework. And last, we saw from Lalmi Prague that it's a matter of perspective on how you reach that point, where Rabbi Akiva reached the point through his own exertion, his own amilut, while on the other hand, Moshe achieved it all prophetically, and that meant that true, they could reach the same conclusion, but their way of getting about it is very different. And Moshe simply didn't understand how you could possibly reach that point without the assistance of God. Of course, that then led to the last question we had about how did Rabbi Akiva get to a noble end. So part of that is because God decided. And some things, some questions, simply don't have answers. Sometimes you simply say, it's a question, God knows, and that's simply where we have to end the discussion. Because sometimes, such as the case of Tzaddik Baralo, where bad things happen to good people, and the only one who could possibly know all of the reasons is God. And we are not God. And it's important to remember that even when we elevate others to those who may know far more than us, to remember that we are all still humans, and that ultimately we all have to answer before God, and that hopefully that by remembering the message, we will remember that we have to follow the laws of the Torah, even if sometimes they appear foreign to us and aren't quite part of us as they should be. And hopefully by doing so, we will not repeat the mistake of the Jews, whether it be by Chetei Egel or what they did in the time of Hosea when they were led astray.
So I don't know if you had mentioned this, but part of what I've heard about Moshe not understanding Rabbi Akiva is that the Torah, the halachas are very fluid. From the interpretation throughout the generations, it develops into something different. I don't know if different's the right word, but
right. That each of them add on their new layers onto it.
Right.
Right. So that's along the lines of what Shemot, Rabbah, and Halkarrim, that he didn't receive absolutely everything. He received the general principles, the general ideas and rules that from which the rest will eventually be derived, but not literally everything. So the only problem with that is that it doesn't answer it says that the Midrash says that Moshe knew every single thing, including what the question the student will ask in class. So it doesn't quite solve that literal understanding of the Midrash, but it does help a little bit in terms of how Moshe couldn't have understood. Which is why, so the Rashi is the one that'll will keep those intact, because it simply says it's out of sequence. So therefore, eventually Moshe will know, but just not at the moment. Or there's the Marali Prague's answer that it will eventually get there. Just right now, it is not.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Hopefully, we will be continuing next week when we discuss Moshe's role in the and how the culmination of the creation of the Mishkan works out.
All right. Thank you.
Send it to me. Can you send me an email with it, and I'll put in the bulletin.
Will do. Okay.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good to see you.